November 23, 1504, just 3 days before her death, Queen Isabella signs a codicil to her last will and testament. In it, she adds a clause concerning a matter that had weighed heavily on her soul for years. The document reads, "When the Holy Apostolic See granted us the islands and mainland of the ocean sea, discovered and yet to be discovered, our primary motivation was to attract its peoples and convert them to the Catholic faith. We intended to send prelates, clergy, religious orders, and other learned and God-fearing persons to instruct the inhabitants in the Catholic faith, teach them good customs, and fulfill their duties with diligence in life. Therefore, I beseech the king, my lord, and I command the princess, my daughter, and the prince, her husband, to do likewise, and to ensure that this remains their principal objective. They must see to it that the indigenous peoples of the Indies, both conquered and yet to be conquered, suffer no harm to their property, but are treated justly, and if they have suffered any injustice, let it be repaired." These were not the words of a conqueror seeking gold or glory. They were the words of a woman who understood that power without conscience is tyranny, and that a kingdom built on faith cannot be sustained by cruelty. This is the story of the woman who defied destiny itself. This is the story of Isabella of Castile, the Catholic, in a land torn asunder, without peace, without unity. A child was born who would alter the course of history. The Iberian Peninsula in the mid-15th century was a fractured mosaic of competing kingdoms. Castile, Aragon, Portugal, Navarre, and the last remnants of Islamic rule in Granada, each was a world unto itself, often at war with its neighbors and even with itself. It was into this turbulent world that Isabella was born, the second child of King John II of Castile and his second wife, Isabella of Portugal. Her arrival was not greeted with great celebration, for she was a second daughter, and the kingdom had hoped for a male heir to secure the succession. But from her very first moments, there was something in her bearing that would later prove to be far more valuable than mere gender. A steeliness of purpose that would define her entire life. By the time she was 3 years old, her world had already begun to crumble. Her father, King John II, died suddenly, leaving the throne to his eldest son, Henry IV, Isabella's half-brother. The loss of the king was a blow from which her mother would never fully recover. The queen began to show unmistakable signs of mental decline, bouts of melancholy, episodes of irrational behavior, and a gradual withdrawal from reality itself. In response, the new king, Henry IV, made a decision that would shape Isabella's formative years. He sent the young Infanta, along with her mother and her younger brother Alfonso, away from the luxuries of court life to live in relative seclusion. They were relocated to the castle of Arevalo, a stark, windswept fortress on the plains of Old Castile. Here, surrounded by stone walls and silent fields, Isabella grew up in comparative simplicity. There were no grand feasts, no elaborate tournaments, no endless processions of courtiers vying for favor. Instead, there was the cold echo of footsteps on stone corridors, the distant sound of wind sweeping across the meseta, and the ever-present melancholy in her mother's eyes. The young girl observed this decline with a maturity far beyond her years. She became her mother's quiet companion, watching helplessly as the woman who had once been a queen faded into a shadow of herself. To bear these painful moments, Isabella turned to her faith with a devotion that would never waver. She spent hours in prayer, seeking wisdom and strength from a God she believed had a purpose for her. even when that purpose was not yet clear. Despite the isolation, Isabella was not entirely abandoned to obscurity. Thanks to the loyalty of certain nobles and tutors who had remained faithful to her late father, she received an education that was remarkably thorough for a princess of her time. Her studies went far beyond the traditional feminine pursuits of embroidery and household management. She was introduced to the principles of humanism, the intellectual movement that was sweeping across Europe, reviving the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome. She learned grammar and rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech and clear writing. She studied painting, philosophy, and history, devouring the lives of great rulers and learning from their triumphs and their failures. Her tutors instilled in her a sense of discipline and a genuine love for learning that would distinguish her from many of her contemporaries. In every lesson, the young Infanta displayed a fervor that was uncommon. Her Catholic faith and her thirst for knowledge walked hand in hand. She saw no contradiction between the spiritual and the intellectual. Unbeknownst to her, these years of study were preparing her for an extraordinary destiny, one that would demand every ounce of wisdom and courage she could muster. As she grew older, the political landscape of Castile became increasingly unstable. Henry IV's reign was plagued by conflict, his authority challenged by a restless nobility who resented his perceived weaknesses. Despite having shown little interest in his half-siblings for years, the king suddenly summoned Isabella and her brother Alfonso back to court. The reason was almost certainly political. He wanted to keep them under his direct control in a time of growing uncertainty. For Isabella, arriving at the royal court was like stepping into a different world. She discovered a realm of opulent halls, glittering jewels, and sumptuous fabrics, a stark contrast to the austere life she had known. But she also quickly learned that the court was a snake pit of intrigues and calculated whispers. She became the object of scrutinizing glances and hushed conversations in corridors. The young princess understood with painful clarity that in this palace she was not a beloved sister returning home. She was a pawn on a vast political chessboard, to be moved and manipulated according to the whims of those who held power. The tensions in the kingdom soon engulfed her as well. In 1465, a group of powerful nobles rose in open rebellion against Henry IV, marking the beginning of what would become a genuine Game of Thrones. During the so-called farce of Untold, these nobles staged a theatrical humiliation of the king. They placed an effigy of Henry on a throne, then stripped it of its royal insignia and cast it to the ground, symbolically deposing him. In his place, they elevated Isabella's younger brother, Alfonso, as the new monarch. This act, though theatrical in nature, unleashed a full-blown civil war that would tear Castile apart for years to come. Henry, forced by circumstances, accepted humiliating terms to preserve his throne. Among these concessions, ironically, was a demand that Isabella once again be removed from court, this time to the Altsy Tsar of Segovia, where she would be kept under strict surveillance. For the next several years, the kingdom of Castile remained divided between those who swore allegiance to Henry IV and those who pledged their loyalty to the young Alfonso XI. The princess, caught between factions, lived with a divided heart. She felt a sense of familial duty toward her half-brother Henry, but she also harbored deep affection for Alfonso, who was being cynically used as a rival to the throne. She watched helplessly as the kingdom bled, knowing that the ambitions of powerful men were far more important to them than the lives of ordinary people. This unnatural situation of having two kings in a single kingdom could not last, and it ended with a tragic twist of fate. In 1468, the young Infante Alfonso died suddenly. His death, shrouded in rumors of poison and foul play, remains a mystery to this day. But one thing was certain: his passing left Isabella as the most viable alternative to Henry's rule. In the aftermath of Alfonso's death, Henry IV, who was derisively known as the Impotent, due to rumors about his inability to produce legitimate heirs, was once again recognized as the absolute monarch of Castile. In a crucial agreement, he formally recognized Isabella as his heir presumptive, displacing the rights of his own daughter, Juana. This young girl, who was mockingly called La Beltraneja by her enemies, was widely believed to be the illegitimate daughter of Beltran de la Cueva, the king's favorite and a man of considerable power. The accusations of illegitimacy would haunt Juana for the rest of her life, and they would become a central justification for Isabella's own claim to the throne. The following year, Isabella received unsettling news. Henry IV had arranged a marriage for her with Alfonso V of Portugal. This was not the first time she had been used as a bargaining chip in a diplomatic arrangement. Years earlier, she had been proposed as a bride to Pedro Giron, the powerful master of the Order of Calatrava, a man many years her senior. That particular alliance had collapsed thanks to a convenient illness that struck Giron, preventing the wedding. But this time was different. King Alfonso V was in good health and possessed the full backing of the Portuguese crown. For Henry, this marriage was a way to neutralize Isabella and ensure that she did not become a rallying point for his enemies. For Isabella herself, however, the prospect was deeply unwelcome. She had other plans for her future, and she was determined to take control of her own destiny. Isabella had already chosen her future husband. Her choice was Ferdinand of Aragon, a young prince who was her equal in intelligence, ambition, and political cunning. With the help of her trusted ally, Archbishop Carrillo, she had been exchanging secret letters with Ferdinand for some time. She knew that he was courageous and sharp-witted, a man who would not be content to simply be her consort, but would be a true partner in rule. He was the companion she desired, both for personal affection and for strategic political reasons. Behind the back of her half-brother, the king, Isabella moved her pieces with extraordinary secrecy and skill. She was advised by the ever-loyal Archbishop Carrillo, who believed that a marriage with the heir to Aragon would give Isabella the military backing she needed to secure her position. Together, they conspired to arrange a clandestine wedding with Ferdinand, the son of King John I of Aragon. To maintain absolute discretion, Ferdinand arrived in Castile disguised as a common servant, accompanied by only a handful of trusted companions. He had undertaken a long and dangerous journey in secret, traveling across hostile territory to reach his bride. In the intimacy of that furtive ceremony, far from the eyes of the court and the reach of Henry's spies, Isabella and Ferdinand sealed an alliance that would change the history of Spain forever. Their secret marriage united the two most powerful crowns on the peninsula, Castile and Aragon. It was not merely an act of love. Though their mutual affection was genuine, it was also a brilliant political move that would consolidate Isabella's position in Castile and lay the groundwork for the eventual unification of Spain under a single monarchy. From that moment on, they were a team, their destinies intertwined, their ambitions shared. The year 1474 would prove to be the most momentous of Isabella's life. Castile was dressed in mourning, for a cold December morning brought the news that her half-brother, King Henry IV, had finally died. The moment had come, without hesitation. Isabella summoned the authorities of the city of Segovia and demanded official recognition of her rights as the rightful sovereign. Before the assembled people of Segovia, Isabella took the crown, demonstrating an audacity that was rare for any woman of her era, let alone one so young. At just 23 years of age, she proclaimed herself Queen of Castile. She did not wait for a grand coronation ceremony or for the approval of those who might oppose her. She seized her destiny with both hands. But her recent coronation was merely the beginning of the ordeal. The young queen faced an immediate and direct threat to her legitimacy. Her niece, Joanna la Beltraneja, supported by dissident nobles who were eager to see Henry's line continue, as well as by her betrothed, King Alfonso V of Portugal, also claimed the throne of Castile. Within weeks, the kingdom was once again divided, and civil war erupted with a ferocity that would test Isabella's mettle to its very limits. This conflict would extend over the next 4 years, a brutal and bloody struggle for the soul of Castile. Yet Isabella did not give an inch. Her conviction was unshakable. Though the throne she had only recently seized hung by a thread, she summoned loyalties, ordered mobilizations, and organized the defense of her rights with a cool-headed efficiency that surprised even her most hardened supporters. Over the next 4 years, Ferdinand took up the sword and led the armies into battle, while Isabella held the crown steady from the rear. Together, they were the judgment and the force that would restore order to a fractured Castile. While the soldiers slept in their camps, weary from the day's fighting, Isabella kept her vigil in silence, her soul inclined before God, but never before men. She spent countless nights on her knees, her rosary in her hands, praying for the safety of her husband and the success of their cause. The struggle was fierce. Swords clashed, lances shattered, blood soaked the fields, and betrayal lurked in every shadow. From a distance, Isabella prayed with her rosary in hand, her royal standard flying nearby as she observed the battles that her husband led in her name. She received messengers with updates on the carnage, dispatching orders and letters of encouragement to her commanders. She never wavered, never showed fear, even when the news was grim. Her fortitude inspired those around her. Eventually, Ferdinand achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Toro. It was a pivotal moment, one that turned the tide of the war. From that point on, the conflict for Castile had its days numbered. The war finally culminated in 1479 with the signing of the Treaty of Alcasovas. In this agreement, Portugal formally recognized Isabella as the rightful Queen of Castile. Defeated and humiliated, Juana la Beltraneja was forced to renounce all her claims and withdraw her threat once and for all. Isabella showed no mercy in her final judgment. She decreed that her young niece should enter a cloistered convent in Coimbra, effectively sealing her political fate forever. Joanna would spend the rest of her days in seclusion, a ghost of a queen whose only crime was being born into a world of scheming and deceit. Shortly after this triumph, Ferdinand II ascended to the throne of Aragon, following the death of his father. Thus, Castile and Aragon were dynastically united under the royal couple. Although each kingdom retained its own laws, institutions, and customs, the dual power structure became a joint force that would dominate the Iberian Peninsula for centuries to come. The young queen, in barely half a decade, had consolidated her legitimacy, pacified Castile, and forged the most powerful alliance the peninsula had ever seen. But her greatest deeds were still to come. Long before Isabella was born, 7 centuries earlier, when the peninsula was a bewildering mosaic of fragmented kingdoms, a nobleman resisted the forces of invasion in the mountains of Covadonga. His name was Pelayo. It is said that with a handful of men, he held the line against overwhelming odds, igniting a flame of resistance that would never be extinguished. For more than 700 years, entire generations lived, fought, and died on a soil split by faith, the crescent moon and the cross, the south and the north. And so, when Isabella ascended the throne in Castile, that ancient wound was still bleeding. Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on the peninsula, remained standing, a symbol, a bastion, a challenge to the idea of a unified Spain. After securing her legitimacy in Castile, Isabella knew that the true unification of her kingdom was still incomplete. The south, the last vestige of Islamic power in the peninsula, resisted stubbornly from the walled city of Granada. In 1482, the final campaign began, a prolonged and brutal war of sieges, pitched battles, and strategic maneuvers that would last an entire decade. This was no swift conquest, no glorious cavalry charge that would sweep away the enemy in a single season. It was a grinding, exhausting conflict that drained the treasury and tested the patience of the entire kingdom. Isabella, faithful to her vision of unity under a single faith, never rested. She traveled with the army, enduring the same harsh conditions as the soldiers. She inspected camps, oversaw logistics and supply lines, and personally tended to the wounded and the sick. She rode through rain and mud, through scorching heat and bitter cold, showing a resilience that earned her the profound respect of her troops. It was during this tumultuous time that a man appeared at her court, a man with a blazing look in his eyes, a foreigner bearing maps and speaking of impossible dreams. His name was Christopher Columbus. He spoke to her of endless oceans, of reaching the east by sailing west. Many in her court dismissed him as a madman or a charlatan. Some openly mocked his theories. But Isabella did not. She listened to him, not once but many times over the course of several years. She said no more than once, but she never closed the door entirely. Deep within her, she understood that faith also expands on new wings, and that the mission of spreading the gospel knew no boundaries. And so, even while the cannons were aimed at the walls of the Alhambra, another war was being waged in her court, a war of imagination and audacity. January 1492. Bells echoed through the snowy valleys of Granada. After 10 long years of war, the last Muslim kingdom on the peninsula had finally fallen. At the gates of the Alhambra, Boabdil, the last Nasrid Sultan, handed over the keys to the city. He was silent, defeated, his proud dynasty brought to an end. Isabella, dressed in white, surveyed the scene without jubilation and without vengeance. There was no triumphant gloating in her expression. There was only faith and purpose, the quiet conviction of someone who had fulfilled a divine mission. With that single gesture, the culmination of a history spanning 7 centuries, from Pelayo at Covadonga to this moment on an Andalusian hill, was complete. The Reconquista was over, but in the heart of the Queen, another crusade was just beginning. April 1492. After years of doubts, delays, and divided counsel, Isabella made a final decision. She decided to take the gamble. In that stone hall, without perhaps fully comprehending the enormity of what they were about to do. The monarchs signed more than just a formal agreement. They sealed the beginning of a new world. Columbus received ships, titles, and the resources he needed to make his voyage. It is said that the Queen pawned her own jewels to finance the expedition. Whether this is historically accurate or simply a cherished legend, it speaks to the depth of her commitment. She did this all for her faith, a faith that no longer sought merely to unite the peninsula, but to cross the ocean itself. And so, while the sails swelled with the wind and the old world fell away behind them, centuries of faith, ambition, and promise traveled aboard those wooden planks. From the shore, Isabella watched the tiny ships disappear over the horizon, unaware that she had just opened the door to an entire continent. With that act, a new chapter was written, one that would carry the cross and the crown far beyond the limits of the known world. Spain would never be the same, and neither would the rest of humanity. Just 4 years later, in 1504, Isabella of Castile left this world behind. In her will and testament, she left precise instructions for her successors, ensuring that the indigenous peoples of the newly discovered lands would be treated as equals, and encouraging intermarriage with these populations. She went further, explicitly recognizing the titles and rights of the native nobility, ordering that they be respected and honored. She made the evangelization of the Americas the primary mission of Spain, not as a justification for conquest, but as a genuine obligation of conscience. She wanted the natives to be taught the faith, not by force, but by example and persuasion. This was her final legacy, the codicil she signed just days before her death, a document that would echo through the centuries. In 1512, inspired by her final wishes, the laws of Burgos were formally enacted. Among other provisions, these laws legally prohibited the enslavement of the indigenous people. They regulated the encomienda system, a labor arrangement that had been prone to abuse, requiring that workers be paid a fair wage and treated humanly. They established that every indigenous community must have adequate housing and land, and that the clergy should provide for their spiritual and physical well-being. While these laws were not always perfectly enforced, they represented a revolutionary step forward in the history of human rights. In 1542, these laws were revised and strengthened to further favor the native population, a process that continued throughout the Spanish colonial period. Years later, the comprehensive laws of the Indies would emerge, a vast compilation of all legislation designed to protect and guarantee the rights not only of indigenous peoples, but of all citizens living within the Spanish Empire. Under this imperial legal framework, almost every aspect of life was regulated. There were laws governing working hours, mandatory rest for pregnant women, maternity leave, and sick leave. The labor of children and the elderly was prohibited, and savings funds were established to cover workplace accidents. While there were certainly those who resisted the implementation of these laws, colonists who saw them as an intrusion on their profits and power, there were also those who gave their lives to defend these laws and the rights of the indigenous people. Men like Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who spent decades fighting against oppression and advocating for justice, drew inspiration from Isabella's vision, even as he criticized the injustices that continued to occur. Isabella was born into a medieval world, a world of constant betrayals, internal conflicts, and divided kingdoms. Her childhood was one of isolation and hardship, her youth marked by political maneuvering and the shadow of civil war. She rose to power through sheer determination, faith, and an unshakable sense of divine purpose. When she took the throne, Castile was a fractured, war-weary nation. When she died, she left behind a kingdom that had been transformed into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. A place where, as the saying goes, the sun never set. She had unified the peninsula, financed the discovery of a new continent, and laid the legal foundations for the protection of millions of people she would never meet. Her legacy is one of contradictions. A woman of deep piety who waged holy war, a champion of indigenous rights who presided over conquest and subjugation, a monarch who broke the mold of her time and yet remained bound by its limitations. She was not a perfect saint, nor was she a ruthless tyrant. She was, above all, a human being driven by an extraordinary vision, whose decisions shaped the world we live in today. Her story is not merely a chronicle of power and ambition. It is a testament to the enduring power of conviction, the courage to defy convention, and the profound impact that one determined soul can have on the course of history.